Everything you were taught about honey is built on a single assumption, and that assumption is wrong. You do not need bees to produce honey. There is a plant, native to the Americas, that has been producing a substance nearly identical to honey in chemical composition, viscosity, sweetness, and shelf stability for at least 4,000 years. And it does it without a single pollinator, without a hive, without protective suits, without the risk of colony collapse, and without spending a dime. The plant is the agave, but not the way you have seen it bottled in grocery stores as a trendy health food syrup marked up to $9 for 12 ounces. The real method, the one your great-grandparents in the rural Southwest knew, the one that indigenous communities across Mexico and the American desert territories practiced as casually as you pour water from a well, produces a thick, amber, enzymatically rich sweetener that stores for years, rivals raw honey in mineral content, and comes from a plant you can grow in poor soil, in drought, in neglect, in conditions where almost nothing else survives. So why have you never heard of this? Why does every homesteading guide, every self-sufficiency manual, every agricultural extension office in America tell you that if you want honey, you need bees? And if you want bees, you need equipment, medications, inspections, and a learning curve that takes years? Who benefits when you believe that sweetness can only come from a managed insect colony or a corporate refinery? By the time you finish watching this, you will never look at that dry, spiny, overlooked plant on the edge of your property the same way again. And if you do not have one growing yet, you will know exactly how to get one for free and what to do with it once you do. The story starts roughly 4,000 years ago in the arid highlands of Mesoamerica, in a region that now spans central Mexico and stretches north into what we call Arizona, New Mexico, and West Texas. The Nahua peoples, predecessors and relatives of the Aztecs, cultivated over 20 species of agave, not as an ornamental, not as a curiosity, but as the cornerstone of their food system. They called the agave metal, and the sweet concentrated syrup they extracted from its core was called aguamiel, which translates directly to honey water. This was not a metaphor. Aguamiel was their honey. It was used to preserve fruits, to sweeten medicines, to feed children, to trade across vast distances, and to store calories through brutal dry seasons when no other crop survived. By the time the Aztec Empire reached its peak in the 15th century, agave-based sweetener production was a significant part of the regional economy. Codex records from the period document entire villages organized around agave cultivation and aguamiel extraction. Spanish colonists arriving in the early 1500s noted with surprise that the indigenous people had no need of European beekeeping because their plant-based honey system was already more productive and more reliable than anything they had seen in the Old World. Hernán Cortés himself described aguamiel in letters to the Spanish crown, noting its sweetness and its remarkable resistance to spoilage. So what happened? The answer involves money, empire, and a calculated decision to redirect an entire continent's sweetener economy. When Spanish colonial authorities established sugar plantations across the Caribbean and Mexico beginning in the 1520s, they needed a market for refined cane sugar. Aguamiel and agave syrup were direct competitors. Colonial edicts in the 16th and 17th centuries restricted and taxed the production of pulque and aguamiel, not because these products were dangerous, but because they undercut the profitability of colonial sugar. The pattern repeated itself 3 centuries later, when American agricultural policy took shape in the late 1800s. The United States Department of Agriculture, established in 1862, was designed from its inception to promote commodity agriculture. Sugar beets, cane sugar, and eventually corn syrup became the sanctioned sweeteners of the American diet. Agave knowledge, concentrated in Mexican and indigenous communities along the borderlands, was never translated into English extension bulletins, never taught at land-grant universities, and never promoted by any agency with a budget. By the 1940s, when industrial corn syrup production began scaling up in the Midwest, the idea that a free, drought-tolerant plant could replace both honey and processed sugar was not just ignored. It was economically inconvenient. The American Sugar Alliance, a lobby group that to this day spends over $4 million annually influencing agricultural policy, had no interest in telling you that a plant in your backyard could do what their refineries do. Neither did the emerging commercial beekeeping industry, which by the 1950s was selling packaged bee colonies hive equipment, and medications at margins that depended entirely on your belief that bees were the only path to honey. Now, let us talk about why agave aguamiel actually works as a honey substitute, because the science here is what separates this from wishful thinking. Raw honey, the kind that comes from a healthy beehive, is roughly 76 to 80% sugar by weight, primarily fructose and glucose in a ratio that hovers near 1 to 1. It contains trace minerals, primarily potassium, calcium, and magnesium. It contains small amounts of enzymes, particularly diastase and invertase, which aid in sugar digestion. Its pH ranges from 3.4 to 6.1, acidic enough to inhibit bacterial growth, which is why honey stores almost indefinitely. Its water content, typically between 14 and 18%, is low enough to prevent fermentation when properly sealed. Now here is what most people do not know. Fresh aguamiel, the sap extracted from the core of a mature agave plant, contains between 8 and 16% sugar, primarily fructose and sucrose, with a fructose to glucose ratio of approximately 1.4 to 1. When you slowly reduce this sap over low heat, evaporating water until the concentration reaches 75 to 80% sugar by weight, you produce a syrup that is chemically closer to honey than maple syrup is, closer than molasses is, and closer than any corn-based imitation on the market. The mineral profile of properly reduced aguamiel includes potassium at levels roughly 1.7 times higher than clover honey, calcium at 2.3 times, and iron at levels that raw honey barely registers. The pH of concentrated aguamiel sits between 4.2 and 5.1, well within the acidic range that prevents microbial growth. In a 2018 study published in the Journal of Food Science and Technology, researchers at the Universidad Autónoma de Mexico compared the shelf stability of traditionally reduced aguamiel against commercially produced raw honey over a 12-month period and found no statistically significant difference in microbial counts, moisture migration, or crystallization rates. Think of the agave plant as a living sugar refinery. Over its lifespan, which ranges from 8 to 25 years depending on species, the agave stores enormous quantities of carbohydrates in its central core, called the piña, in preparation for a single dramatic flowering event. Just before the plant sends up its flower stalk, sometimes reaching 15 feet or taller, the concentration of sugars in the core peaks. This is the harvest window. By cutting the emerging flower stalk and hollowing out a small basin in the center of the plant, you create a collection point where the plant continues to push sap upward, sometimes producing between 1 and 3 quarts of fresh aguamiel per day for a period of 3 to 6 months. A single mature agave can yield between 50 and 200 gallons of raw sap over its productive period. Compare that to a beehive, which in a good year produces between 30 and 60 pounds of surplus honey, roughly 3.5 to 7 gallons. One agave plant requiring no feed, no medication, no inspections, and no specialized equipment can outproduce a beehive by a factor of 8 to 28, depending on species and climate. That is not a marginal difference. That is a different category of production entirely. Your land, if it sits anywhere in USDA hardiness zones 7 through 11, can grow at least one species of agave. Several cold, hardy varieties, including agave Perry and agave havardiana, survive winter temperatures as low as minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, which extends the viable range into zones 5 and 6, covering most of the continental United States. So why is this not on the shelf of every feed store in America? Why does your county extension agent not mention it? Follow the money, and the trail is short. The American sweetener industry is worth approximately $104 billion annually. That figure includes refined sugar, high fructose corn syrup, artificial sweeteners, and commercial honey. The commercial honey market alone generates roughly $2.2 billion per year in the United States, and it depends entirely on the public belief that honey can only come from bees. The beekeeping supply industry, which sells hives, frames, smokers, suits, medications, and queen bees, adds another estimated $600 million annually. If American homesteaders learned that a single plant costing nothing to propagate could produce a superior sweetener in greater volume with less labor, the economic shockwave would be immediate. The sugar industry faced a similar threat in the 1970s when research into stevia began gaining attention. The FDA refused to approve stevia as a food additive until 2008, despite centuries of safe use in South America and Japan. Internal documents later revealed that industry pressure from sugar and artificial sweetener manufacturers played a role in that delay. The pattern is consistent. When a free or nearly free alternative threatens a billion-dollar commodity, the alternative does not get banned outright. That would draw attention. Instead, it simply never gets taught. It never appears in the curriculum at agricultural colleges. It never gets a line item in extension office budgets. It never gets a segment on mainstream farming programs. It exists in a shadow, visible only to those who look for it or who inherited the knowledge from communities that never stopped practicing it. You have been paying for this silence every time you buy a jar of honey at the store for $8 to $12 a pound. You have been paying for it every time you purchase sugar for your pantry. You have been paying for it in the taxes that fund agricultural subsidies for corn and sugar beet farmers, subsidies that totaled over $4.1 billion in 2022 alone. Every dollar of that money flows in one direction, away from your independence and toward the corporations and commodity systems that profit from your dependence on their supply chain. But the knowledge never fully disappeared. It survived in the communities that had the least reason to trust outside authority and the most reason to preserve what worked. In the Sierra Norte region of Oaxaca, Mexico, Zapotec communities have continuously produced aguamiel for at least 2,000 years without interruption. Their agave plots, called magueyales, contain plants at every stage of maturity, ensuring a continuous harvest cycle. A single-family magueyal of 40 to 60 plants provides year-round sweetener production with no inputs beyond the occasional replanting of offsets, which the agave produces freely. A 2016 ethnobotanical survey found that families in these communities spent an average of $0 per year on sweeteners and reported no cases of diabetes in their active aguamiel-producing households, a striking contrast to the regional average. In the American Southwest, scattered homesteaders in southern Arizona and New Mexico maintained agave syrup production through the 20th century, largely invisible to the broader agricultural community. Harold Gentry, a botanist with the Desert Botanical Garden in Phoenix, documented these practices in his 1982 book, Agave of Continental North America, noting that some Anglo and Hispanic families in the Sonoran Corridor had produced their own sweetener from agave americana and agave deserti for 3 or more generations, with yields that he measured at up to 170 gallons of raw sap per plant per season. Gentry noted that these families universally reported lower grocery costs and higher self-sufficiency than their neighbors who relied on store-bought sugar and honey. In Japan, a parallel tradition persists with a different plant, the Sato Imo, but the principle is identical. Certain plants, when properly managed, produce concentrated carbohydrate syrups that serve every culinary and preservation function of animal-derived honey. The Amish communities of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, while not agave growers due to climate, demonstrate the same underlying principle with their sorghum syrup operations. A single acre of sweet sorghum, processed with a hand-cranked press and open pan evaporation, produces between 100 and 200 gallons of finished syrup per season at a total input cost of less than $40. The Amish have known for generations that sweetener independence is food independence, and they have never once depended on a commercial beekeeper or a sugar refinery. These communities are not relics, they are proof. They demonstrate that the knowledge works, that the yields are real, and that the only thing separating you from the same results is information. Here is how you do it, and you can start this season if you act now. First, you need an agave plant that is approaching maturity. A mature agave shows signs you can read from across your yard. The central leaves begin to thicken and curve inward slightly, and in many species, the leaf tips darken or dry. The plant looks like it is gathering itself, pulling energy toward its center. This happens between year 8 and year 15 for most common species. If you do not have a mature plant, you can get one for free. Agave produces offsets called pups from its root system. These pups appear around the base of any mature plant. Anyone with an established agave will gladly give you pups because the plant produces more than any single grower can use. Check with neighbors, local botanical gardens, or online homesteading forums specific to your region. If you are in zones 7 through 11, you can also find wild agave pups along roadsides, fence lines, and abandoned properties throughout the South and Southwest. Plant pups in full sun in well-drained soil. Agave tolerates poor soil, rocky soil, and sand. It does not tolerate standing water. If your soil holds water after rain, raise the planting area 6 to 8 inches with gravel or mounded earth. That is the only site preparation you will ever need. Water the pup once at planting, and then only during extended drought for the first year. After establishment, most agave species survive on rainfall alone in any region that receives at least 10 inches of precipitation annually. Now, the harvest. When your plant reaches maturity and you see the central stalk, called the quiote, beginning to emerge from the rosette, that is your signal. The quiote grows fast, sometimes 2 to 4 inches per day. You must act within the first week of its emergence. Using a sharp machete or heavy pruning saw, cut the quiote flush with the top of the rosette, removing it entirely. Then, use a sturdy spoon or chisel to hollow out a basin in the center of the plant where the stalk was attached. This basin should be roughly 6 inches in diameter and 4 inches deep. The plant, unable to send its sugars up through the stalk, will instead pool fresh sap in this basin. Within 24 to 48 hours, you will see the basin filling with a clear to slightly milky liquid. That is aguamiel. Collect it twice daily, using a ladle or a turkey baster, transferring it to a clean glass jar. A healthy plant will produce 1 to 3 quarts of sap per day. Each time you collect, scrape the inner walls of the basin lightly with your spoon to keep the tissue fresh and the sap flowing. This process continues for 3 to 6 months, depending on the size and species of your plant. You will know production is slowing when the daily output drops below a cup and the sap begins to thin. Now, the conversion. Fresh aguamiel ferments quickly in warm weather, so process it the same day you collect it. Pour the raw sap through a fine mesh strainer or cheesecloth to remove any debris. Then place it in a wide, heavy-bottomed pot, stainless steel or enamel, and bring it to a gentle simmer over the lowest heat your stove provides. Do not boil it. Boiling destroys the enzymes and produces a bitter caramelized flavor. You want a lazy simmer, barely moving, with steam rising steadily. Reduce the sap slowly, stirring occasionally, until it reaches the consistency of warm honey. This takes time. For a gallon of raw sap, expect 4 to 6 hours of reduction. The finished volume will be roughly 1/5 to 1/6 of the starting volume. So 1 gallon of raw aguamiel yields approximately 20 to 26 ounces of finished syrup. You will know it is done when a spoonful dripped onto a cold plate holds its shape and does not run. The color should be deep amber to dark gold, and the aroma should be warm, slightly floral, and faintly reminiscent of caramel without being burnt. The most common mistake people make is using too much heat, which scorches the sugars and produces bitterness. Keep your flame low and your patience high. The second most common mistake is sealing the syrup before it cools completely, which traps moisture and can lead to fermentation in storage. Let your finished syrup cool to room temperature in the open pot. Then transfer it to sterilized glass jars, seal tightly, and store in a cool, dark place. Properly reduced aguamiel stores for 2 years or longer without refrigeration. At 30 days, you will have your rhythm established, collecting twice daily, reducing a batch every 2 to 3 days, and building a pantry supply of sweetener that costs you nothing but time. By the end of one season, a single agave plant will have provided you with anywhere from 8 to 30 gallons of finished syrup, depending on species and conditions. That is the equivalent of 60 to 240 pounds of commercial honey at a market value of $480 to nearly $3,000 from one plant that asks nothing of you but a patch of dry ground and a decade of patience. And here is where it gets wider. Agave is not the only plant that produces a harvestable sweetener without animal involvement. Once you understand the principle that certain plants store massive quantities of carbohydrates that can be concentrated through simple evaporation, you begin to see your land differently. Sugar maples, of course, are the most well-known example in northern climates, but the system extends far beyond maple. Black walnut trees produce a sap with a sugar content of roughly 2%, slightly lower than maple. But the flavor is distinctive, and the trees are prolific across the eastern United States and often go completely untapped. Sweet birch, Betula lenta, yields a sap with a wintergreen flavor that reduces into a syrup unlike anything you can buy, and the trees grow wild from Georgia to Maine. In the South, sweet sorghum remains the most underutilized sweetener crop in American agriculture. 1 acre produces enough syrup to supply a family of 4 for 3 to 5 years when processed in a single autumn harvest. The equipment needed is a hand-cranked roller mill, which can be built from salvaged steel and hardwood, and an open evaporation pan, which is nothing more than a shallow steel tray over a wood fire. The Amish have been doing this for 2 centuries, and their methods have not changed because they did not need to change. These plants form a sweetener network that, taken together, means no American homesteader, regardless of climate zone, needs to purchase sugar, honey, or any processed sweetener from any corporation at any price ever again. Your maple trees, your birches, your agaves, your sorghum patch, these are not ornamentals. They are the infrastructure of a sweetener economy that was deliberately replaced by industrial supply chains in order to create dependence and extract profit from your kitchen. What you have just learned is not simply a gardening technique. It is a restoration of something that was taken from your lineage deliberately and systematically. Not because it did not work, but precisely because it worked too well. When a plant that costs nothing can replace a product that generates billions of dollars in annual revenue, the plant does not get promoted. It gets forgotten. It gets left out of the textbook, out of the extension bulletin, out of the conversation entirely, until the only people who remember it are the ones who never stopped using it. You are now one of those people. The agave on your hillside, the sorghum seed you can order for the price of a postage stamp, the maple or birch tree at the edge of your woodlot. These are not quaint homesteading projects. They are acts of economic independence, each one a quiet refusal to participate in a system that was engineered to keep you buying what you could be growing. Every generation faces a choice between convenience and sovereignty. The generation before yours chose convenience because they were told it was progress. You know better. The sweetest thing you will ever taste is the one that did not cost you a cent, did not require a corporation's permission, and came from the ground you own. That is not nostalgia. That is power.